I could tell something had shifted the second I walked into Jordan Ellis's office and found him staring at his phone instead of acknowledging my presence. No greeting, no gesture toward the chair across from his desk, just him scrolling through what looked like a golf tournament bracket while I stood there like a servant waiting for permission to exist. The afternoon sun cut through the window at a harsh angle, painting everything in that washed-out yellow that makes expensive furniture look cheap. On the corner of his mahogany desk sat a single white envelope with my name printed on it, positioned so perfectly it might as well have been spotlit. "Kinsley," he said without looking up, "your position is being dissolved effective immediately. This isn't personal. It's a restructuring decision. Security has been notified." That was the entire speech. 9 years of transforming this organization from a scrappy startup operating out of a converted warehouse into a multinational revenue engine, and I got less acknowledgement than his morning coffee order. No handshake, no explanation beyond corporate buzzwords, not even the decency of faked regret. He just dismissed me like clearing browser history. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't so perfectly timed, coming exactly 3 hours after I'd delivered our finalized expansion roadmap that I'd spent 17 consecutive weekends perfecting while Jordan was posting yacht photos from leadership retreats in the Mediterranean. I picked up the envelope slowly, feeling the weight of standard termination paperwork inside. When I finally met his gaze, his eyes were flat and rehearsed, already mentally checked out and probably thinking about his next meeting. I could have exploded right there, could have let every justified piece of rage pour out, but instead I spoke with perfect calm, almost pleasantly. "Let's make absolutely sure we handle this correctly. By the way, if you're finding this story interesting so far, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps us continue creating these stories. Surprisingly, 97% of people who watch never subscribe, but you can be part of the 3% who do." Right back to the story. I signed every page right there in his office. My hand didn't shake, didn't hesitate, just smooth signatures like I was approving expense reports. When I slid the documents back across his desk, Jordan gave a tight nod and muttered, "Someone will walk you down in a moment." I stood, tucked the envelope under my arm with the same energy I'd use for a lunch receipt and walked out. Didn't pause at the doorway for one last look, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing anything resembling emotion. Security met me at the elevator bank like we'd choreographed it days ago. One guard, early 40s, trying too hard to look authoritative in a uniform that didn't quite fit right. He asked if I needed to collect personal belongings from my workspace. I told him no. Everything that actually mattered to me existed either in my memory or buried within legal frameworks Jordan didn't know existed, had never bothered to examine, would never understand even if someone drew him a diagram. As the elevator descended in uncomfortable silence, I felt it building behind my sternum, that familiar heat of humiliation trying to rise up. But underneath that surface emotion lived something far more dangerous, not anger or shock but pure calculation. Because Jordan Ellis had no concept of who he'd just terminated. He thought I was simply another VP of operations, another corporate ladder climber with a good resume and decent business instincts. He had no idea I'd written the original shareholder agreement when this place was nothing but folding tables and credit card debt. Had no clue I'd been the first external investor when the founders couldn't get approved for basic business loans. Jordan never once questioned who Sentinel Capital was on the cap table. Never glanced at the layered trust structures tucked into the back sections of the shareholder documentation that got circulated every quarter. Never wondered why certain voting proxies were structured the way they were. Jordan Ellis didn't know that I owned 87% of Orvex Dynamics, and he'd just terminated his majority shareholder without following a single protocol, without board approval, without due process. I stepped into the lobby, gave a small smile to the front desk attendant like this was any other Wednesday afternoon, and pushed through the glass doors into the crisp October air. It was cool and sharp, the kind of weather that cleared your head. My breath misted as I crossed the plaza and slid into the back of a waiting car. I didn't give the driver an immediate destination. I just sat there for a moment, letting the pieces settle into place, then pulled out my phone and began the sequence. 10 years ago we were barely credible. 5 people, a malfunctioning copier, and a coffee maker that turned everything into something resembling motor oil. The original founders were genuine innovators, no question about it, but they couldn't structure a business if their lives depended on it. They were engineers, product builders, visionaries who could code solutions in their sleep, But spreadsheets, vendor negotiations, capitalization tables, all of that was completely foreign territory. That's where I came in, and I never wanted the spotlight. I wasn't interested in having co-founder plastered across my email signature or standing on stage at industry conferences doing demo presentations. Titles are temporary theater. Real leverage is invisible and permanent. So while they scrambled to secure seed funding from angels who kept passing, I made them a different kind of proposal. I drafted the founding documents myself, an operating agreement that stretched across 63 pages of deliberately plain language, dry as sand, sharp as surgical steel. I offered a substantial cash investment channeled through a holding company that nobody questioned because nobody ever questions the person handling logistics. I was just operations, the detail-oriented one, the person who made sure contracts got signed and bills got paid. They were thrilled to hand off the boring administrative work to someone competent. But every clause I drafted served a specific purpose. Every percentage point hidden behind trusts, every silent share structured through Sentinel Capital was a safeguard, a fail-safe, a firewall against precisely the kind of arrogant fool Jordan would turn out to be. Across 4 early funding rounds, 2 equity-based, 1 convertible note, 1 bridge loan, I funneled more capital into Orvex Dynamics than all 3 original founders combined. The shares were technically anonymous. Sentinel Capital signed every agreement, appeared on every distribution list. My name showed up in the major stakeholder registry, not directly, but I controlled the board voting mechanisms. The founders' agreement granted me material decision notification authority for any major operational changes. The 4th appendix tied board votes to majority approval not of the executive team, but of actual equity holders with controlling interest. Everything was documented in black and white, just buried deep enough that nobody would bother reading it, especially not a sales-focused CEO who thought due diligence meant skimming a summary deck. I remember the day Jordan's appointment was announced. The press release used words like transformative leader and innovative strategist, claimed he was brought in to guide the next phase of hypergrowth. He wore these expensive tailored suits and started calling the strategy team his inner circle. Everyone began moving faster, smiling wider, laughing at jokes that weren't funny. Nobody seemed to notice that Jordan didn't understand half the technical platforms we operated on, but I noticed. I sat quietly watching him deliver these motivational speeches about disrupting paradigms and architecting the future. I watched him reorganize departments into colorful org charts filled with corporate jargon. I watched him terminate 3 vendor relationships I'd spent 18 months carefully building because their logos didn't match his new brand vision. And I said nothing because I knew the moment would come when he'd cross the line he didn't know existed. And when it did, I already had every legal mechanism in place. Every trigger embedded in the foundation, every weapon sharpened and ready. He just didn't know where not to step. Jordan had absolutely no idea what Sentinel Capital represented. Had no clue what I'd constructed while everyone else was perfecting pitch decks and running on caffeine during product launches. I wasn't the founder people followed on social media. I was the name people forgot on purpose, and that was exactly how I designed it. I didn't want their applause or recognition. I wanted their silence when everything shifted, and I was about to get exactly that. The termination paperwork was completely generic, standard boilerplate they probably downloaded from some HR software template library. Jordan hadn't even bothered customizing the language. It still contained the phrase termination without cause, like that made it somehow merciful or legally safer. He didn't understand what that specific phrase actually activated within our operating agreement. I'd signed without flinching, without sarcasm or speeches, just a signature that looked ordinary but marked the beginning of a procedural earthquake Jordan was catastrophically unprepared for. I handed him my security badge, my access card, my building key. He didn't say anything meaningful, probably assumed I was in shock or denial. Maybe he thought I'd go home and rage cry into wine and draft a bitter email at 3 a.m, the kind he could forward to HR with an eye roll, then delete and forget. Instead, I walked out those front doors, took a car 4 blocks north, and checked into a hotel suite I'd kept reserved on a rolling contract for exactly this type of scenario. The key card had a thin layer of dust on it. I hadn't actually used this room in 3 years, but everything was exactly as I'd left it. Neutral colors, minimal furniture, ready to function. I plugged in my laptop, connected to the secure private server, and opened the encrypted vault containing the complete founder's agreement with every clause, every amendment, every timeline notation preserved in searchable format. Right there, buried in Appendix D, was my trigger point. The material decision notification clause was the first thread I pulled. It clearly stated that any major operational change, including termination of an executive-level employee holding more than 5% vested interest, required formal notification and review by all primary stakeholders. That obviously hadn't happened because nobody knew I held 87%. Second was the board majority pre-approval requirement, and that one was my personal favorite, an obscure provision I'd inserted during the third equity restructuring round. It mandated that any executive termination involving a founder or early investor with controlling interest had to be pre-approved by a supermajority of the board, or the action would be considered procedurally invalid and subject to immediate reversal or formal vote. And Jordan, he'd bypassed the entire board. No vote, no notification, no consultation, just ego wrapped in expensive fabric making unilateral decisions. I drafted the notification letters myself. No legal team, no templates, just clean, precise language that was legally bulletproof and digitally time-stamped. Each letter was sent directly to individual board members' private email addresses using the contact protocol outlined in the 2017 Agreement Addendum. No intermediaries, no warning shots. The subject line read, Activation of Clauses 14b and 21d. Notification of Material Termination Event. The message body was brief and clinical. As the primary controlling stakeholder operating under Sentinel Capital, I am hereby notifying the board of a material decision executed on October 18 at 2:15 p.m. regarding the termination of an executive role with controlling interest. This action was undertaken without proper board notification or approval, and as such, both Clause 14b and Clause 21d are now active pending formal review. Attached was a PDF of the original operating agreement, fully annotated and time-stamped, alongside a scanned copy of my termination documents, signed, certified, legally admissible in any court. Then I pressed send. No phone calls, no threats, no dramatic social media posts. Just the beginning of a procedural correction that would feel to Jordan like the floor vanishing beneath him while he smiled for a photo opportunity. I closed the laptop and poured myself a drink. Not to celebrate, not yet, but because I knew I'd spent a decade building a system that would never require a raised voice, just documentation. By noon the following day, the legal department had gone completely silent. Not a single email from the usually hyperactive in-house counsel. No new contracts circulating through the approval system. Not even a reminder about next month's compliance training that Jordan had been promoting aggressively. The silence spread through the building like a gas leak, fast, invisible, impossible to trace unless you knew exactly what to look for. I knew exactly what I'd triggered and it was working flawlessly. At 11:43 a.m., the company's general counsel, Matthew Cross, a man who once described legal audits as speed bumps on the innovation highway, received a formal stop order. The language was precise, cold, devastatingly effective. Effective immediately, all material actions including executive hiring, termination, corporate restructuring and international expansion activities are frozen pending formal review by the majority ownership stakeholder in compliance with operating clauses 14b and 21d. Violations will be considered breaches of fiduciary duty under Delaware corporate law. Jordan had no idea what hit him. I'm told he was in the middle of rehearsing a keynote presentation for some strategic partnership summit when the notice landed on his desk. I wasn't there obviously, but I have extremely reliable sources. Apparently he didn't believe it initially, thought it might be a prank or a technical error. Said something like, "Who the hell is the majority stakeholder? This has to be some kind of mistake." It absolutely was not a mistake. While he was busy shouting into his phone demanding explanations, board members were opening encrypted files that had been delivered directly to their personal email addresses, files they weren't supposed to receive unless two very specific conditions were met: material operational deviation and confirmed violation of established clause protocol. Each person opened an identical file. Subject line: Beneficial Ownership and Control Review. Inside was a complete forensic breakdown of Orvex Dynamics equity structure going back to the founding year. Sentinel Capital, voting proxy pathways, layered trust mechanisms, tax compliance filings, SEC documentation, and my name quietly attached in a notarized declaration as sole controlling agent of Sentinel. It wasn't a threat or a negotiation. It was a statement of documented fact. One board member, I'm told, read the entire file 3 times before saying a word. Another forwarded it immediately to his private attorney, not because he wanted to challenge me, but because he realized in that moment how much they'd all missed while Jordan played king. The energy in the building shifted. The mood during that afternoon's emergency session wasn't panic or chaos. It was restraint and recalibration. They didn't know yet what I intended to do, but they understood it was now completely out of Jordan's control. And perhaps more importantly, maybe it had never actually been in his control at all. Jordan stormed into that boardroom like a general entering a battlefield. I want explanations, he barked, voice echoing off the walls. I want to know who thinks they can override the CEO's authority without so much as a courtesy call. Nobody responded. He paced along the windows, demanded to see the legal team immediately. Called the chairman complicit in some kind of internal conspiracy. Shouted something about rogue investors manipulating governance, which only made him sound increasingly paranoid and unhinged. The room didn't push back. They didn't reassure him or nod in agreement. They just watched because every single person sitting at that table now had the file. Every single one now understood what he didn't. He didn't run this company and never had. They'd seen the clauses, the ownership trail, the embedded vote structures that now made every decision he'd executed, every hire, every initiative, every budget reallocation, not only voidable but potentially grounds for shareholder litigation. They understood the brakes had been applied quietly, surgically, and Jordan, the man who thought he could erase me with a single bland sentence, now found himself completely frozen, arms gesturing wildly, the engine he thought he controlled now locked in place. All that remained was the board meeting, the one I had just formally requested. The call came just after 1 in the morning. Private number, no caller ID preview, just the persistent vibration on my nightstand like someone knocking politely on a locked door. I already knew who it was before I answered. "Hello, Nicholas," I said, voice perfectly steady. A long pause. "I wasn't aware," the chairman finally said. There was weight behind those words, but not confrontation, just bewilderment, maybe even a flicker of respect, like someone discovering they'd been sitting on a loaded gun for years and only now felt it click. "You weren't supposed to be," I replied simply. More silence. Then, with the same measured tone he used when announcing quarterly earnings on investor calls, he said, "Let's schedule a meeting." Properly. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "I've already prepared the voting materials. You'll have them within the hour." No extended negotiation, no probing questions, just a seasoned executive who understood immediately what it meant when someone speaks softly while holding all the documentation. I didn't delay. The proxy packet had been assembled months before Jordan even joined the company. It wasn't reactive, it was insurance. Documents signed and notarized by an independent compliance firm, listing the full ownership structure under Sentinel Capital, my binding vote authority, and the dormant clauses now active due to Jordan's unauthorized action. The entire package was legal armor plating. I attached it to the secure board distribution system with a full audit log and timestamp. The subject line was deliberately boring: shareholder voting proxy, special session materials. But the message below contained just one line: let's ensure compliance before further disruption. No threats, no legal jargon, no inflammatory language, just a gentle reminder. This wasn't a negotiation or a power struggle. This was course correction, and every board member received the identical packet. They didn't need to respond or acknowledge receipt. They knew it was legitimate. They'd seen the ownership trail, they'd witnessed the freeze, and now they saw the next step: a vote that Jordan wouldn't be permitted to influence. I reserved the boardroom myself, specifically requested the original conference space on the 7th floor, the same room where we used to crowd around mismatched chairs, sketching business models on whiteboards we couldn't afford to replace. Back then, nobody wore designer suits or carried Italian leather portfolios. We wore exhaustion and ambition in equal measure. The room still had that faint smell of old carpet and burnt coffee. I appreciated that. It felt honest. Jordan, predictably, tried to relocate the meeting, claimed it sent the wrong message to stakeholders, argued the space was beneath the standards of the current executive leadership. The request was denied. Nicholas, the chairman, replied with just 4 words: "We'll follow protocol." And that was the final crack in Jordan's illusion of control. The board had chosen a side quietly, without announcements or drama, because when the documentation is sound, The chain of authority speaks louder than any tantrum. Jordan didn't realize it yet, but the next time he walked into that room he wouldn't be sitting at the head of the table. He'd be the subject line of the agenda. The atmosphere in the conference room felt different that morning, heavier, like the air pressure had changed. They tried to dress it up naturally. Jordan made sure of that. Fresh floral arrangements on the credenza, premium bottled water at every seat, a catered breakfast spread nobody was touching. He sat positioned at the head of the table like he owned the entire building, hands folded, expression composed, wearing his favorite charcoal suit buttoned perfectly like ceremonial armor. I almost respected the commitment to maintaining appearances. The board members entered slowly, some avoiding eye contact entirely, others offering neutral acknowledgments that communicated nothing. The chairman, Nicholas, was the last to arrive. He didn't sit immediately, didn't smile or make small talk. He simply placed a thick leather folder onto the table and began speaking. This meeting was convened to address procedural irregularities regarding the termination of an executive stakeholder. He began, voice measured and calm as a closing bell. Before we proceed, I'd like to formally enter the revised shareholder register into record. He paused deliberately, then opened the folder and read clearly. Sentinel Capital, managed by Miss Kinsley Porter, currently holds 87% controlling interest in Orvex Dynamics as verified by legal counsel and contract documentation dating back to 2014. The silence that followed was absolute. No throat clearing, no chair movement, not even the ambient hum of the ventilation system seemed to penetrate the moment. Jordan's expression barely changed at first, like his brain needed extra processing time to translate what had just been said out loud. But then comprehension hit and the color drained from his face so rapidly I could pinpoint the exact second he registered what the chairman had just announced. 87%? His voice cracked slightly when he finally spoke. There must be some kind of error. That can't possibly be accurate. Nicholas didn't respond to him. He simply turned to page 2. The operating agreement, as amended in 2018 and ratified by Council in 2020, grants majority control rights to the beneficial owner of Sentinel Capital, which includes authority to trigger clauses 14B and 21D, and to request a board vote of confidence on executive leadership. At that, Jordan pushed his chair back slightly, like the seat had suddenly become uncomfortable. This is completely absurd. We need to adjourn immediately. I want independent legal counsel present. You're welcome to retain legal representation for subsequent meetings, Nicholas said, still not raising his voice. But this session will proceed as scheduled. The vote itself wasn't dramatic or contentious. It was clean and efficient. One by one, the board members raised their hands or stated their position verbally. Yes. 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 A few looked down at the table when they voted. Some didn't. One woman stared directly at Jordan the entire time, her expression completely unreadable, neutral as granite. 11 votes total, 1 abstention from someone who clearly wanted no part of the situation. Not a single person voted to retain him. Nicholas gave Jordan the courtesy of a brief pause before closing his folder. In light of the board's vote and Miss Porter's controlling interest, effective immediately, Jordan Ellis is removed as Chief Executive Officer of Orvex Dynamics. No applause, no exit music, no dramatic declarations, just the dull scrape of Jordan's chair as he stood slowly, like his legs weren't entirely convinced this was happening. He didn't look at me, not once during the entire proceeding. Maybe because deep down he knew if he did, he'd see it clearly. The trap he walked into, the documents he never bothered reading, the ego that blinded him to every warning sign. Maybe he thought he could still spin this later, reframe it as some kind of unfair boardroom coup or a technicality he could challenge. But it wasn't. It was simply the rules, the ones I wrote, being applied exactly as designed. He walked out under his own power, didn't wait to be escorted, didn't say a word. The sound of the door closing behind him seemed louder than anything else that had happened that morning. Nobody moved for at least a full minute afterward. Then Nicholas cleared his throat. Let's move forward to agenda item 2, interim leadership transition. And just like that, the page turned. I didn't sit in Jordan's chair, didn't even approach it. The room still carried traces of his cologne, expensive and overbearing, slightly desperate. That chair had become a symbol of everything inflated and fragile about his leadership style, and I had zero interest in inheriting that kind of symbolic weight. Titles had never been my currency anyway. Influence was, and I already possessed that, signed and documented. So I made a different decision. I appointed Leah Brennan as interim CEO. Leah had been operating in the background for years, quiet, exceptionally sharp, completely allergic to corporate theater. She understood infrastructure and human dynamics in equal measure. More importantly, she understood which kind of silence meant stability and which kind signaled danger. That nuance had been completely absent under Jordan's leadership, replaced by constant noise, rebrands, summits, motivational emails that said everything and meant nothing. Leah didn't send out a dramatic announcement or post an inspirational quote on professional networks. She walked into her first executive meeting with a 4-page strategic outline and a simple directive: we listen before we change anything. And the entire organization exhaled. The reorganization wasn't flashy or complicated. There were no elaborate org charts with gradient colors or innovation pods. Just precise, thoughtful adjustments. The vendor relations team, decimated by Jordan's ego-driven purges, was carefully rebuilt with former contacts and restored partnerships. Procurement stabilized almost immediately. Engineering got realistic timelines back. Marketing stopped chasing viral trends and started responding to actual performance data again. I observed it all unfold from the periphery, not as a ghost, not as a monarch, but as something closer to a compass. Deals that had stalled under Jordan's visionary urgency began moving forward again. One of our international licensing partners who had completely ghosted us after a disastrous leadership summit scheduled a call within 3 weeks of the transition. When asked why they were suddenly responsive again, they simply said, "We heard there's someone rational making decisions now." Internally, something fundamental shifted throughout the building. You could feel it in the hallways, the elevator conversations, the energy in meeting rooms. It wasn't fear-based anymore, it was alert and engaged. Employees who had emotionally checked out started asking substantive questions again. Teams that had gone completely silent began submitting not just deliverables but suggestions and ideas. The Friday afternoon Slack activity returned, not memes and sarcasm, but genuine small moments. Gratitude, curiosity, people reaching out not because they were required to, but because something felt worth being part of again. I didn't need public credit or recognition. The people who needed to know already did, and those who didn't just saw the company stabilizing itself, like a ship that had been listing dangerously to one side finally easing back into proper balance. Jordan's name stopped coming up in conversations after a while. Nobody memorialized him or eulogized his tenure. Nobody openly mocked him either. It was like watching a severe storm pass through and collectively deciding not to dwell on the furniture it damaged. He just cleaned up and moved forward. One afternoon I was walking past the open atrium area near the engineering department. A junior developer I'd never formally met was showing a new hire around the building. She pointed up toward the executive suite and said casually, "That's where the new CEO works, the one who actually listens to people." She had no idea I was standing less than 15 feet away, and that was exactly how I preferred it. It was a Thursday morning, overcast sky the color of old newspaper, the kind of weather that made everyone walk faster with their heads down. I parked in the same corner spot I used to use before everything happened, a little too narrow, slightly inconvenient but close to the main entrance. No fanfare, no reserved sign with my name on it, just the rhythm of returning to something I'd never truly left. I walked through the front doors without hesitation, swiped my updated badge with different credentials but identical authority, and watched the green light blink confirmation. The security guard barely glanced up from his phone. The receptionist, though, did a visible double take. Not in fear or shock, just recognition. She opened her mouth like she might say something. I gave her a small nod, gentle and brief, and kept walking. She didn't stop me or ask questions. Nobody did. The click of my shoes down the main hallway echoed louder than I remembered. Or maybe it had always been that quiet and I'd just forgotten how much silence follows authority when it doesn't need to announce itself. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. That conference room, B4, with the long oak table and the fluorescent lights that never quite looked right, had once been where Jordan stood flanked by his yes-men, grinning like a game show host. The energy back then had been synthetic, overly rehearsed, weirdly aggressive, like every presentation was a performance and every question an attack. Now the room felt organized, purposeful. And there he was, Nolan Grant, Senior VP of Corporate Development, the same man who had escorted me out that day, holding a branded folder like it contained state secrets, avoiding eye contact while muttering, "I'm really sorry, this is just protocol." He'd looked almost relieved when the elevator doors closed behind me that afternoon. Now he was seated at the conference table mid-discussion with Leah and several department heads. When he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, something flickered across his face, panic mixed with guilt, maybe both. He half stood, his mouth already forming what I'm certain would have been some combination of apology and damage control. I raised one hand slightly. "Let's focus forward," I said simply. That was it. No tension, no slow clap, no theatrical moment, just redirection. He sat back down. Leah gave me a brief nod, professional and aligned, and resumed the conversation without missing a beat. That was intentional too, no formal reintroduction, no announcement that I was back, because I'd never actually been gone in the way people assumed. Titles had changed, circumstances had shifted, but I remained the architect of the foundation beneath their feet. The meeting began, focused on our Asia-Pacific expansion, logistics challenges, vendor compliance across multiple regions, multi-partner onboarding, the kind of detailed strategic work I'd always excelled at. I listened more than I spoke, asked 3 questions, received 4 different perspectives. Leah led the discussion and I let her. That was always the plan. The room carried a completely different tone now. Tighter but not tense, more focused. The performative edge had vanished. These people weren't competing for proximity to power, they were genuinely trying to build something functional again, and that was all I'd ever wanted. After the meeting concluded, as people stood to leave, a few lingered, not out of obligation but something else, quiet acknowledgement perhaps. They shook my hand, said, "Good to see you again," or, "Glad you're here." No long speeches, just the kind of presence that carried weight now, the kind that couldn't be erased by a white envelope or removed by changing a nameplate. As I walked back through the lobby toward the exit, the receptionist smiled softly. She didn't ask if I needed anything or offer assistance. She already understood I had everything I needed. I stepped back out into the cool morning air, pulled my coat a bit tighter and smiled to myself. Not because I had returned triumphantly, but because I hadn't needed to announce it at all. 4 months passed. Not in silence but in steady rhythm, the kind of rhythm that indicates an organization is genuinely healing. Not rapidly, not loudly, but with clear direction and purpose. I still didn't maintain a formal office on the executive floor, didn't need to. Leah managed the daily operations with clarity and calm precision, and I kept my seat on the board where my presence mattered most. Strategic oversight, capital allocation decisions, long-term structural protection. The building didn't feel like a war zone anymore. It felt like a company again, like a place where people came to do meaningful work instead of navigate political minefields. Then one afternoon, while I was reviewing our revised European market licensing framework, my phone buzzed with a message from Nicholas, the chairman. No text, just a link. Jordan's professional networking profile. I probably shouldn't have clicked it, but curiosity got the better of me. His profile picture had changed. Still professionally photographed, still wearing that same charcoal suit, though now it looked more like a costume than a uniform. The post beneath it read, "After a period of deep professional reflection, I'm excited to begin advising early-stage founders on strategic exits, brand elevation and transformational leadership. Every ending is a new beginning." I read it twice, then laughed once, not cruelly or bitterly, just the way you might laugh at a book you once thought was profound before realizing it had no actual ending, just stopped mid-sentence. The engagement was sparse. A handful of generic comments, one from some mutual connection I hadn't thought about in years. But then, buried beneath the surface-level responses, there was one comment that made me pause and read it 3 times. It was from a board member, one who had voted yes in that conference room on that cold October morning. The comment simply said, "Perhaps start by reading your own governance documents next time." No emoji, no follow-up explanation, just that single sentence. A precise surgical incision through the self-congratulatory narrative Jordan was trying to construct around himself. That comment had been liked 83 times. I recognized at least 4 familiar names among them, people who knew exactly what it referenced. It stayed there, unedited and untouched, like everyone had collectively decided that nothing more needed to be said on the subject. That was the real final chapter. Not Jordan's post, not his attempted rebrand, but that one comment sitting there permanently in the digital record. Because ownership isn't about optics or perception management. It's not about a networking profile headline or how confidently you sit at the head of a conference table. It's about what you build when nobody's watching, the foundations buried beneath ego and assumption, the clauses nobody reads until it's too late, the leverage nobody respects until it's already been activated. Jordan Ellis fired me thinking I was disposable weight, an outdated operational manager, a footnote in his narrative of transformational leadership. But that morning when he slid that white envelope across his desk without even making eye contact, he wasn't eliminating a middle manager or restructuring a department. He was terminating his own authority, signature by signature, clause by clause, one procedural violation at a time. And he never saw it coming because he never bothered to look, never thought the person handling logistics could possibly be the person holding all the cards. I built this company from folding tables and credit card debt. I structured every agreement, funded every critical round, embedded every safeguard into the legal architecture. I didn't do it for recognition or applause or a corner office with my name on the door. I did it because I understood something Jordan never could. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention or respect. It simply exists, documented and unshakable, waiting patiently for the moment someone crosses a line they didn't know was there. And when that moment comes, when someone finally steps exactly where they shouldn't, real power doesn't shout or threaten or make dramatic speeches. It just activates, quietly, precisely, irreversibly. Jordan learned that the hard way, sitting in a boardroom surrounded by people who finally understood what I'd always known. The person who writes the rules controls the game even if nobody remembers their name. Especially if nobody remembers their name. That's not revenge. That's just architecture.